55,000 RAF airmen never made it home. On any given night, entire crews vanished. 1 in every 2 airmen were killed or captured, the deadliest odds of any Allied service. But the darkest truth about World War II bomber crews is not just in the numbers. It is in the unbearable tension before takeoff, the dread that haunted every mission, and the disasters that could, and often did, strike without warning. What did it actually feel like to face those odds? Out of every 100 men who climbed into the bombers of RAF Bomber Command, 55 would never return. The death toll reached 55,573, more than the entire British losses during the Blitz. For Canadians, the odds were even worse. Nearly 10,000 RCAF airmen died, and by 1944, Canadians made up almost a third of Bomber Command's strength. Australia sent 10,000 men, and over 4,000 were killed, many flying in squadrons like 460 and 467. Polish crews, fighting for a country already lost, filled entire squadrons and paid dearly, about 2,800 killed. Behind each number stood a crew, a pilot fresh from training, a Canadian navigator, an Australian rear gunner, a Polish wireless operator. Each man's life balanced on the edge of a mission sheet. In the shadows of briefing rooms and the silence before engines started, these statistics became flesh and blood, ordinary men aware that every raid might be their last. Mission briefings arrived like a summons. For RAF crews, the call came as dusk settled. Men filed into a room thick with cigarette smoke and silence, eyes fixed on the map, waiting for the target to be revealed. The route, the flak zones, the odds. Every detail was spelled out, and then the long hours stretched ahead. Some tried to joke, others sat with hands trembling, staring at the floor. In the mess hall, tea went cold as men rehearsed the flight in their minds, picturing the searchlights, the bursts of flak, and the way home. Psychologists now call this anticipatory trauma, a slow, grinding fear that built before every operation. The dread was so familiar it had its own rituals, checking Lucky Charms, writing one more letter, counting the beds that might be empty by morning. One veteran remembered that the worst part wasn't flying, it was waiting. You sat there knowing you might not come back, and there was nothing to do but wait. Berlin, Nuremberg, Schweinfurt, these names became shorthand for disaster among bomber crews. The Berlin campaign in the winter of 1943 and the spring of 1944 turned every raid into a roll of the dice. Night after night, 5 to 8% of the attacking force vanished. Dozens of bombers were lost in a single operation. On March 30th, 1944, the Nuremberg raid sent 795 aircraft toward their target. By dawn, 96 had been shot down, 12% gone in one night, the worst loss in Bomber Command's history. For the men who survived, the empty spaces in the mess hall the next morning said more than any official report. Across the channel, American crews faced their own nightmare. The Schweinfurt-Regensburg mission cost the 8th Air Force 16% of its B-17s in a single day. Then came Black Thursday, October 14th, 1943, when 60 out of 291 bombers were destroyed, a loss rate of over 20%. Each disaster hammered home a single truth. The ODDS were collapsing and no crew could count on making it home. In 1940, the RAF introduced a term that would haunt airmen for decades: lack of moral fiber. The policy began with a memo from the Air Ministry defining LMF as any crew member who, in the eyes of his commanding officer, failed to show the necessary resolve to fly. There was no appeal and little medical inquiry. If an airman admitted fear or refused to fly, his fate was sealed. The process was swift and humiliating. The man was stripped of his aircrew brevet, often in front of his peers. Officers were forced to resign their commissions, and non-commissioned men were demoted to the lowest rank, aircraftman second class. The badge came off with a public gesture, and the airman was removed from flying lists. Many were posted to menial ground duties, sweeping hangars, digging ditches, or sent to coal mines. The intent was clear: to deter others by making an example. The label followed men in their records, and too often for the rest of their lives. Unlike the Americans, who spoke of combat fatigue or operational exhaustion, the RAF's language was a sentence. Within the squadrons, fear was not just of flak or fighters, but of being branded LMF, of losing not just your nerve, but your name. The math of survival became its own ritual. In the 8th Air Force, crews once looked to the 25 mission mark as a finish line. Then, in March 1944, the quota jumped to 30. By summer, it climbed again to 35. Each new order landed like a sentence handed down from above, with no room for argument. RAF Bomber Command operated on its own system. 30 sorties for a first tour, then for those who lasted, a second round of 20 more. For most, the numbers were academic. During the Berlin campaign, the ODDS of finishing a 30-mission tour stood at just 18%. Chalk marks on a hut wall tallied missions, survived, wiped away, and started over as new crews replaced the lost. In 1943, the entire roster of the U.S. 8th Air Force would turn over every 4 or 5 months. So many names were erased that the act of counting became a way to hold on to hope. The Memphis Bells crew, celebrated for completing 25 missions, became a legend, not because their feat was common, but because it was so rare. For the men still flying, the countdown never felt like a guarantee, only a calculation against the odds. 6 hours in the air, sometimes 10. The cold inside a Lancaster or B-17 cut through every layer, and temperatures at 20,000 feet dropped to minus 40 degrees Celsius. Frost rimed the windows, crept into gloves, and settled in the bones. Crewmen worked levers and switches with hands that barely moved, breath freezing on their masks. Flight surgeon logs from 1944 detail numb fingers, burning cheeks, and the slow loss of feeling in toes. If an oxygen mask slipped for even a minute, the world tilted. Vision narrowed, words slurred, thoughts scattered. Some men saw things that were not there, a farmhouse below, a mother waving, the shape of home flickering in the clouds. Fatigue pressed down, heavy as the flak jackets. After 24 hours without sleep, the mind played tricks. Orders were forgotten, targets missed, arguments flaring over nothing. In that thin, biting air, every sense was under siege. Inside every bomber, 7 or 10 men staked their lives on each other, night after night. Crews developed their own small worlds with lucky mascots tucked in pockets, a rabbit's foot on the instrument panel, and a faded photograph taped above the navigator's table. Jokes circled before takeoff, some too grim for outsiders to understand. Rituals gave order to chaos, the same handshake, the same words every time. When a man didn't come back, the loss echoed in silence. Beds left untouched, lockers unopened. One airman wrote that 2 beds were empty. We all sat in silence. The crew wasn't a crew anymore, just a few survivors. Bonds this close meant survivor guilt ran deep. In high turnover squadrons, some stopped learning new names until a replacement had survived a few missions. The fear of loss made friendship both a comfort and a wound. Modern science gives language to what these men endured. Chronic danger activates the body's stress response, the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, flooding the system with cortisol and norepinephrine. Over time, the brain itself changes. The amygdala, the center for fear, grows more sensitive. The hippocampus, which sorts memory and context, shrinks. The prefrontal cortex, needed for calm judgment, loses ground. Every symptom described by bomber veterans, numbness, flashbacks, a sense of being stuck in the past, matches what trauma researchers like Bessel van der Kolk, Stephen Porges, and Peter Levine now recognize as the body's reaction to overwhelming threat. Today, therapies exist that work with the nervous system, not against it, offering hope that the wounds of war can be understood, and sometimes even healed. For some, the scars became a source of strength, reshaping the rest of their lives. Today, we understand combat trauma as injury, not weakness. Yet, nearly half of World War II bomber airmen never came home, and those who did often battled invisible wounds for decades. Their ordeal still shapes how we treat psychological scars in every war that follows. Some truths never lose their urgency.